I'm going to talk to you about radical acceptance, which is from dialectical behavioral therapy. Marsha Linehan talks a lot about radical acceptance in DBT and sometimes changes the wording of this concept to reality acceptance, accepting reality for what it is. When we teach this in relapse prevention skills group, we'll often talk about the word acknowledgement rather than acceptance, because for some people that word is easier to digest. So when we talk about really painful things happening in life and having to accept them for what they are, some people find that that's allowing them to be as they are, and that's not what this concept is talking about. So the word acknowledgement can sometimes just be easier to use. I can acknowledge that this is happening. Marsha Linehan suggests that when we can acknowledge or accept something, it becomes less painful. So she'll say, pain is pain. But pain plus non-acceptance actually creates suffering. So when we can accept something, we reduce our own suffering. Here are 4 steps when explaining radical acceptance to someone. Number 1, you can solve the problem. So if something happens in life that's painful and you can solve it, Marsha Linehan would suggest, just go ahead and solve the problem. Number 2, you could change how you feel about it. Number 3, you could stay miserable. Or number 4, you could accept it. And that's what we're going to talk about more. So when deciding when to use radical acceptance and exploring this with your clients, sometimes it's helpful to use a little bit of a decision-making tree to kind of decide, should I practice radical acceptance at this time? So let's take an event. Something happens that causes some pain. So number 1, you might want to ask yourself, can I solve this problem? If you can, go ahead and solve it. Exit from the decision-making tree. If you can't, it's something that's happening that you can't change or solve, then you're going to move on to the next step. Can you change how you feel about it? Yeah? Okay, exit the decision-making tree. If you can't, then you're going to move on to the next step. Do you want to stay miserable? Do you want to continue to feel this pain and be stuck in it? Some people say yes, they want to, they're not ready to move. Exit the decision-making tree, stay miserable. But if you don't, then you're going to move on to the next step, which is acceptance. So as you practice acceptance, there's a few different things that Marsha Linehan would suggest. Number 1, she uses the word radical because it's complete and total. It's not like, oh, I can sort of accept what's happening. It's a full, total body acceptance or acknowledgement of the situation that's happening. The next thing that she talks about are the 3 parts of radical acceptance. So number 1, you can accept reality for what it is. Number 2, everything has a cause. And number 3, that life is still worth living even with really painful events in it. Let's explore these a little bit more. So number 1, accepting reality for what it is. Sometimes it's easy to want to make painful situations go away. So we put our head in the sand like an ostrich would do and try and pretend that life is different when we pull our head out of the sand. But life doesn't work that way. We often have to acknowledge things as they are so that we can deal with them. So number 1, accepting it for what it is. Really kind of facing it and acknowledging it and being real with yourself about what's happening. Number 2, accepting that everything has a cause. So we can all get stuck in magical thinking or believing that the world is against us. Why me? Everything bad happens to me. And these sort of judgments are, they get in the way of radical acceptance. And if we can take more of a view that everything has a cause, bad things happen because bad things happen. And that there's causes, natural causes that make these things happen, then this helps us to get out of the magical thinking or judgmental thinking that believes that the universe might be against us. So number 2, everything has a cause. And number 3, life can still be worth living even with really painful events in it. And for some people, life actually even becomes more rich after painful events. I was working with someone who was facing some jail time, and he was really distressed by this and feeling a lot of anxiety, losing a lot of sleep. He couldn't picture himself in jail. It just wasn't his destiny. He didn't believe that's where his life should be heading or would have ever been heading, and he was stuck. And he was in a group where we were talking about radical acceptance, and one day he came into group and he looked visibly different. And we happened to be talking about radical acceptance that day, and he shared with the group that he'd acknowledged the fact that he was going to jail, and that really was going to be the consequence for some decisions that he had made, and he actually wasn't afraid of it anymore now that he was facing it and preparing for it and planning for it. He felt like a load had been lifted off his shoulders. But when he was fighting with it, it felt a lot harder to face, and like it was actually creating a lot more pain and suffering. So life can still be worth living even with really painful events in them. When talking to clients about this, it's not really something that we can kind of pull out a worksheet and just work through radical acceptance. It's a lifelong struggle for all of us. We have a human natural tendency to want to avoid painful things, and it can feel really counterintuitive to face something painful and acknowledge it and to stare at it and look at it and be real about it. So oftentimes you can kind of make this topic lighter by talking about practicing it in the day-to-day things. So for things like when you break a dish, when you get stuck at a red light, when you're typing your case notes and you forget to press save and you lose all of your work on the computer, or when children aren't listening to you, during bad weather, if a sports team loses. So some of these kind of day-to-day opportunities to practice radical acceptance can be a much lighter place to try the practice. And we all need a bit more of this in our lives. And so if we practice it in the day-to-day, we probably become a bit better at doing it when the big, real situations come up and the painful events occur, and we need to practice radical acceptance.